The most unplanned moments in life often become the ones you are least willing to let go of in the end. I never imagined that a single impulsive act on a night of a brutal Chicago blizzard would completely rewrite the script of my ordinary existence. Outside my window, the wind whipped through the falling snow and tore the glow of the streetlights into jagged pieces. I sat there staring at the delivery app on my phone as the status remained frozen, regretting my decision for the 13th time. Why did I even bother opening it in the first place? In this hellish weather, the delivery drivers would probably need sleds just to make it down the street. I sniffled and grumbled while the heater hummed, but the cold seeping through the window frame still made me shiver as my stomach let out a pathetic growl. I gave up on the app and decided to just boil the half bag of frozen ravioli left in my freezer to tide me over. I shuffled toward the door in my slippers and reached for the hallway light switch. As the dim yellow bulb flickered on, I saw that the concrete floor outside was not empty. Curled against my neighbor's door, which was plastered with old flyers, was a mysterious ball of white fur. It looked like a massive, fluffy snowball. My chest tightened, and I instinctively took a step back. What on earth was that? Did someone lose their dog? Looking at the size, I wondered if it was a Samoyed or an Alaskan Malamute, though nobody in this run-down apartment complex owned a dog that big. The creature was completely motionless, making me wonder if it had frozen to death right on my doorstep. I hesitated before edging forward and squinting for a better look. The white fur was almost blinding in the low light and possessed an eerie, supernatural cleanliness. It did not look like a cat or dog, but rather like a high-end fur coat you would see in a movie. It was curled so tightly into a ball that I could only just barely see the faint rising and falling of its ribs. It was still alive. I breathed a sigh of relief, but remained cautious since you can never be too careful these days. I worried it might be a trap or that the animal would jump up and bite me if I got too close. I looked around the empty hallway as the wind and snow continued to howl outside the window. I gave a tentative shout, but there was no response. I stomped my foot, but the light flickered off anyway, sending a sharp chill down my spine in the sudden darkness. I quickly cleared my throat to bring the light back on. The white figure remained still, but I noticed a dark patch near its hind leg where the color had changed. Dark red blood had matted the long fur into a gruesome, solid clump. It was hurt. Seeing the blood made my guard drop instantly. I am just a tired office worker who usually avoids trouble, but I have a soft heart. I knew I could not live with myself if I left a wounded creature out in the freezing cold. I told myself it just was not my night as I sighed and went back inside to grab a broom. I used the handle to give the white fur a gentle nudge from a safe distance. I told the creature to wake up and move along, noting how incredibly soft it felt. It shifted and let out a tiny, high-pitched whimper that sounded more like a kitten than a dog. That soft and pained sound completely broke my resolve. I tossed the broom aside and knelt down to carefully touch the creature. My fingers brushed through warm, silky fur and felt a damp patch that smelled like iron. It was definitely bleeding. I frowned as I gathered the animal into my arms. It was much lighter than I expected because its small frame was hidden by that thick, fluffy coat. It was incredibly docile and even nudged against my chest for warmth. Its bloody head left a dark smear on my shirt as it moved. I grumbled about having to change my clothes, but carried it inside anyway and kicked the door shut. The sudden warmth of the apartment was a relief. I set the creature down on the living room floor and flipped on the overhead light to see it clearly, only to freeze in shock. This was definitely a fox. It had a pointed snout, upright ears, and a massive tail that looked like a fur scarf. Even though I had never seen one in person, I had seen enough pictures to know this was a snow-white fox. Its fur was pure white without a single speck of another color except for the gash on its hind leg that was still seeping blood and staining the fur red. The wound was not deep, but it looked incredibly painful. Finding a wounded white fox on the 16th floor of an apartment in downtown Chicago was beyond surreal. Forget seeing a fox. You would have to drive 2 hours out of the city just to find a zoo. I wondered where it could have possibly come from, or if it had escaped from a circus. I stared at the unconscious creature with my head spinning. Its breathing was shallow, and its eyes were shut, making its long white lashes look delicate and sad. I decided to stop worrying and just treat the wound. I grabbed my first aid kit and found some alcohol wipes and gauze. The fox flinched when I cleaned the cut, but it did not wake up. The gash looked like it had been made by something sharp, but fortunately it had not hit anything vital. I did my best to disinfect and bandage the leg, finishing it off with a clumsy knot. By the time I was done, I was covered in a nervous sweat. I looked at the little fox taking up a corner of my floor and realized I could not leave it on the cold hardwood all night. I found an old Amazon box and lined it with some old shirts to make a makeshift bed. I carefully lifted the fox and tucked it inside. It seemed to settle in, nuzzling against the fabric before falling back into a deep sleep. I went to the kitchen to boil my ravioli and sat alone at the table, though my eyes kept drifting toward the box in the corner. The whole situation felt completely unreal, from the blizzard to the wounded fox on the 16th floor. I tried to shake off the weirdness and put those old folk tales out of my mind. I told myself that stories about fox spirits were just old superstitions and that animals do not just turn into people. It had to be some rich person's exotic pet that had escaped into the storm. Once I finished my dinner and cleaned up, the fox still had not moved. I peeked into the box and saw that it was sleeping soundly and the bandage was dry. I decided to leave it be until morning, so I took a shower and headed to bed. The storm outside seemed to be dying down. I tossed and turned for an hour with my mind filled with images of the fox. I kept wondering what its eyes would look like once it opened them. I eventually drifted off into a restless sleep. I woke up the next morning to bright sunlight. The snow had stopped and a brilliant sun was shining through the gaps in my curtains. I rubbed my eyes and sat there for a moment before the memories of the previous night came flooding back. The fox. I practically jumped out of bed and ran out of the room without even putting on my slippers. Sunlight was streaming across the living room, and the box was still sitting in the corner. I tiptoed over to peek inside, but the box was empty. All that was left were the rumpled shirts and a few spots of dried blood. My heart dropped as I wondered where it had gone. I called out for the little fox as I searched every corner of the apartment. It was not under the sofa or the table, and the balcony door was locked tight. It could not have just vanished into thin air, so I started to wonder if the whole thing had been a dream. I was standing there scratching my head when I heard a faint clinking sound coming from the kitchen. My heart hammered against my ribs as I thought it might be a burglar. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the corner and tiptoed toward the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar, so I took a deep breath and shoved it open as I raised the bat and shouted to ask who was there. Then I stopped dead in my tracks. The kitchen window was open and letting in the crisp morning air, but that was not what caught my eye. Standing in front of my kitchen sink was not a burglar, but a woman. I could not find the words to describe her. She had her back to me and was wearing the gray hoodie I had left on the chair the night before, the one stained with blood. The hoodie was far too large for her, the hem barely reaching the tops of her thighs. It looked like she had nothing else on underneath. Her bare legs were strikingly pale and perfectly shaped. She had incredibly long silver hair that flowed down to her waist like a shimmering waterfall. As the sunlight hit her, her hair and skin seemed to glow with an ethereal light. She slowly turned around when she heard me enter. The baseball bat slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a loud bang. My brain went completely numb because I had never seen anyone that beautiful in my entire life. Her features were so delicate they did not even look human, and her skin was almost translucent. Her eyes were a pale amber color with pupils that were slit vertically like a cat's. She looked at me with a dazed and sleepy expression and blinked, her long white lashes fluttering like delicate fans. She held up one of my mugs, which was still steaming. She tilted her head and spoke in a voice that was both airy and sweet, asking if I wanted some tea now that I was awake. I stood there with my mouth open, unable to make a sound. I was sure I was hallucinating or stuck in a dream. I pinched my leg as hard as I could and hissed in pain. It was definitely not a dream. How was I supposed to explain this scene? I had a silver-haired goddess standing in my kitchen wearing my dirty hoodie and nothing else, offering to make me tea. My throat felt like sandpaper as I managed to ask who she was and how she got into my apartment. She set the mug down and took a couple of steps toward me. Her bare feet made no sound against the tile as she approached. As she got closer, I caught a faint, clean scent that reminded me of a pine forest after a fresh snowfall. She stopped right in front of me and looked up at my face with a smile that made her eyes narrow into crescents. She managed to look both innocent and incredibly seductive at the same time. She asked if I did not remember her in a soft, playful voice. She reminded me that she had been injured outside my door in the snow and that I had been the one to save her. I was so confused that I did not even know how to react to her calling me young master in this day and age. I pointed a shaking finger toward the empty box and asked if she was the fox from the night before. She gave an enthusiastic nod, and her smile grew even wider. She introduced herself as Sarah and told me she was a white fox who had been training for 500 years. She even gave me a formal, old-fashioned bow that was a little clumsy, but she was so beautiful that it did not really matter. I was not in the mood to enjoy the view because my brain was currently going into overload from the sheer amount of impossible information. A fox turning into a human after 500 years of cultivation was just too much for me to process. It felt like an atomic bomb had gone off in my head. I leaned against the doorframe for support and told her that it was impossible and completely unscientific for animals to turn into people. I was rambling like a lunatic, but Sarah leaned in closer and blinked those innocent amber eyes at me. She pointed out that she had actually gained her spiritual awareness back in 1725, long before the modern era began. I cannot even remember what was happening in history in 1725, but my entire understanding of reality was currently falling apart. I asked her if she was really a fox. She looked slightly hurt by my doubt and offered to change back right then to prove it. A soft white glow began to radiate from her skin, and I quickly stopped her before she could follow through. I told her I believed her and begged her to stay as she was because my heart would not be able to handle seeing a person turn back into an animal. I told her to just stay calm. The light faded away, and she gave me another sweet smile, telling me how kind I was. I took a deep breath and tried to get my bearings, then asked her if she could possibly find some pants to wear. Having her standing there with her long bare legs was incredibly distracting, and I did not know where to look. I told myself to stop thinking about how good her legs looked. She looked down at herself and casually remarked that she did not own any pants and found my hoodie to be very comfortable. I rubbed my temples and told her to tell her to wait right there. I went to my bedroom and dug through my closet until I found a pair of new sweatpants with the tags still on and handed them to her. She took the pants and stared at them with a look of pure confusion before asking me how they worked. I was at a loss for words, so I just gestured and told her to step into them and pull them up to her waist. She gave a nod and started to pull the hoodie up as she stepped into the pants right in front of me. I turned around immediately and pressed my forehead against the cold wall to give her some privacy. I stood there listening to the rustling of fabric and felt like my entire life had become a bad joke. Once she finished, I turned back to see her with the waistband pulled all the way up to her chest. She proudly told me she was finished and even did a little spin like a peacock showing off its feathers. The wide pant legs swung around her like a skirt. I just gave her a distracted nod in response. We stood there in the kitchen in a total, awkward silence. I tried to make sense of the facts, reminding myself that I was just an ordinary 25-year-old office worker who had saved a fox in the middle of the night. Now that fox had turned into a silver-haired woman named Sarah who claimed to have 500 years of training. To top it off, she was standing in my kitchen wearing my clothes and offering to make me tea. This felt like a story that people would have to pay to read online. I had no idea what to do next. I could not exactly call 911 and tell them there was a fox spirit in my apartment without them thinking I was insane. I thought about kicking her out, but she looked so vulnerable and her leg still was not fully healed. I was worried that if I let her go, she would be caught by someone dangerous or end up in a lab somewhere, which seemed completely inhumane. Keeping a beautiful fox spirit in my apartment as a single guy did not seem like a great idea either. I also had no idea if she had any dangerous spiritual habits like draining my life force while I slept. My head was spinning as I tried to process it all. Sarah noticed my distress and leaned in closer to ask if I was okay, and that fresh sin of hers became even stronger. I told her to stop calling me young master and introduce myself as Morrison Sullivan. She repeated my name softly and gave another little laugh. She asked if she could call me Brother Morrison instead, which felt even weirder, but I could not bring myself to say no when she looked at me with such expectation. I sighed and told her she could call me whatever she wanted, but we needed to eat first. I was starving, but my fridge only had some frozen ravioli, a few eggs, and some wilted spinach. I told her I would make some pasta with eggs and greens. She got all excited and followed me into the kitchen like a curious child, telling me she would love whatever I made. As I started the water, she watched me with wide eyes and asked if the blue flame from the stove was some kind of magic. I told her it was just a gas stove. She seemed amazed by the stainless steel sink, so I told her it was just how the metal looked. She acted as if boiling water was some kind of miracle. I could not tell if she was genuinely clueless or just pulling my leg. I felt like I was giving a science lesson to a time traveler while I cooked the pasta. Once the pasta was done, I added the eggs and spinach and divided them into 2 bowls. We sat down at the table, and she tried to use her chopsticks like I did. She was completely hopeless at it and could not pick up a single strand, which made her pout in frustration. I finally gave in and showed her how to hold the chopsticks properly. She still could not get it after a few tries and finally looked at me with piteous eyes, pointing at a spoon and asking if she could use that instead. I handed her the spoon, and she immediately cheered up, slurping the pasta loudly. She had 0 table manners, but I had to admit it was actually kind of cute. I tried to focus on my own food and reminded myself not to be fooled by her looks. After we finished, she followed me back into the kitchen to watch me wash the dishes. She offered to help, but I told her to stay back since her leg was still bandaged. I quickly stopped her from getting near the water. Now that she was human, I could see that the wound was on the back of her thigh. She touched the bandage, and her eyes went dark for a moment. She mentioned that she only ended up at my door because of that injury. I asked her what had actually happened and who was responsible for hurting her. Sarah looked both angry and terrified as she told me it was a bad rat. She explained that it was a rat demon. She started gesturing to show me what she meant. She said the demon had tried to take her territory and her snacks, which led to a fight that she eventually lost. I thought to myself that the spirit world was apparently quite complicated. I asked her if she was planning to go back for revenge once she was all healed up. She shook her head, and her eyes started to well up as she looked at me. She told me she was still weak and that her spiritual power was almost gone, and warned me that the rat demon might still be after her. She asked if she could stay with me for a while, tugging on my sleeve and promising to be good and help around the house to repay me for saving her. Here it was, the classic scenario I had seen 1,000 times in movies. I felt a surge of anxiety and told her it was absolutely impossible because my apartment was way too small and only had 1 bedroom. She immediately pointed at the cramped sofa in the living room and said she would be fine sleeping there. I told her that would not work either because it was not appropriate for a man and woman who were strangers to live like that. She asked if I was rejecting her just because she was a spirit, and her eyes began to fill with tears. I tried to explain that it was not about that. It was just a matter of principle. I tried to be logical and pointed out that in the real world, a girl without an ID living with a single guy would cause all kinds of rumors among the neighbors. Sarah blinked her teary eyes and seriously suggested that we could just tell everyone she was my distant cousin. I told her that wouldn't work because anyone could check and see we weren't related. She then suggested she could just be my pet, noting that she had seen people walking their animals outside, and I could do the same with her. I nearly choked on my drink at the thought of walking a fox on a leash in downtown Chicago. I told her that was absolutely out of the question because people in this city just did not walk foxes. She looked completely baffled by my response and stood there in silence for a few seconds before finally looking down and whispering that she understood. Her voice was heavy with disappointment and sadness. She let go of my sleeve and walked over to the corner of the room, sitting on the floor and pulling her knees to her chest. Her long silver hair fell forward, completely hiding her face from view. She looked so small and helpless, exactly like an abandoned puppy. It was a sight that would break anyone's heart. My mind was racing as my logic told me to get her out of my life before things got even more complicated. But I could not just ignore her like that, especially since she was hurt and that demon was still looking for her. Throwing her out into the cold now would be no different than killing her myself. I rubbed my head in frustration as my compassion finally won out over my common sense. I honestly do not know why I gave in. Maybe it was her looks or just my own soft heart. I walked over and stood behind her, clearing my throat and telling her that the sofa might be an option after all. She shifted slightly and peeked at me with one teary eye through her silver hair, asking if I was serious. Her voice sounded thick, as if she had been crying. I told her we needed to set some ground rules first. She immediately spun around and looked up at me with eyes that were suddenly bright and clear, with no sign of the tears from a moment ago. She told me she would agree to whatever I wanted. I felt a sudden sense of unease, as if I had been played, but I kept a serious face and started listing the rules. I told her first that she was never to enter my bedroom without permission, and second, that she had to keep her true identity as a spirit a complete secret. For the third rule, I told her she was absolutely forbidden from using any kind of spirit magic to influence me. Sarah tilted her head and looked genuinely confused, asking me what a charm spell even was. I felt my face flush as I explained that it was the kind of magic that made men do whatever she wanted. I felt my face burning as she suddenly burst out laughing. She told me I was overthinking things because her kind only relied on natural energy for their power. She explained that those kinds of dark arts had been forbidden for a long time. She hesitated and admitted with a blush that she was completely inexperienced in those matters anyway and would not even know how to do them. I asked if she had the rules down, and she gave an enthusiastic nod and a beautiful smile. She thanked me for letting her stay and suddenly tried to give me a hug. I quickly stepped back to avoid her, leaving her hugging nothing but air. She looked a little hurt by my reaction, but she settled down and stood there quietly. I saw her getting upset again and told her that she could only stay until her leg was fully healed. She did not say a word. She just stared at me with an intensity that made me feel extremely uncomfortable. And so, my life living with a fox spirit began. The first order of business was finding her a place to sleep. My sofa was way too small for her to be comfortable for more than a night. I eventually found an old folding cot in my storage unit and set it up in a corner by the window. I made it up with some clean sheets and blankets and told her that would be her spot for now. I brushed the dust off my hands as I finished. Sarah was fascinated by the cot and kept testing how soft it was. She told me it was much nicer than the stone bed she had back in her cave. I thought to myself that a cave and a stone bed were exactly what I should have expected from a spirit. I asked her where her cave was, and she told me it was out at Sunset Ridge. She sat on the cot and admitted she was worried that the rat demon might have moved into her home while she was gone. I knew the area she was talking about. It was a pretty rugged part of the state where people claimed to see wildlife all the time. I realized that spirits and wild animals probably looked for the same things in a home. I told her to just focus on getting better for now. She gave me a huge smile and told me how kind I was. I had to look away because her smile was becoming way too distracting. I then realized I needed to figure out what she was going to wear since she could not just live in my clothes forever. I checked my bank account and sighed because I was still a few days away from payday. I managed to find some old shirts and joggers that did not fit me anymore and told her to use them for the time being. I promised to get her some actual clothes once I had the money. She did not seem to mind at all and hugged the pile of clothes, telling me she liked the way they smelled. I desperately wanted her to stop saying things that sounded so suggestive. Once she was settled in, I realized it was already past 10 in the morning. Since it was Saturday, I did not have to work, but I needed to go grocery shopping now that I had another person to feed. It was clear from how she ate breakfast that she was going to be a handful when it came to food. I told her I was heading out for groceries and warned her to stay inside and not open the door for anyone. I felt like I was lecturing a child. She sat on the bed and nodded her head, promising to stay put. She told me she would keep an eye on the place, which made me feel a little better. I grabbed my things and was just about to walk out when she called out my name from across the room. I turned around and saw that she had stood up. She was standing in the middle of the room with the sunlight catching her silver hair and making it glow. She looked a little embarrassed as she stood there with her hands behind her back, tapping her foot on the floor. She told me to come back soon in a very soft voice. My heart skipped a beat, and I just gave a quick nod before rushing out of the apartment. Once I was in the hallway, I leaned against the door and tried to catch my breath. My heart was racing as I stood there. I cursed to myself because she was already having this effect on me without even using magic. Unfortunately, the peace only lasted for 3 days. On Tuesday night, I was in the kitchen when I heard Sarah let out a sudden gasp from the living room. I dropped what I was doing and ran out to find her huddled in the corner of the sofa, shaking. Her pupils had narrowed to tiny points as she stared out the window with a look of pure terror. I rushed over to her and asked what was wrong. She whispered in a trembling voice that the rat demon had finally found her. I looked out the window and saw a small, dark figure standing on the roof of the building across the street. Even in the darkness, I could clearly see a pair of glowing red eyes staring directly at us. Those eyes looked like burning coals and were fixed on our window. I felt a cold shiver down my spine, but I stepped in front of Sarah to protect her. I told her not to worry because there was no way he could get inside. I tried to sound calm as I reminded her we were on the 16th floor and the place was locked tight. But then we heard a horrible scratching sound against the window that sounded like dozens of fingernails scraping against the glass. I slammed the curtain shut and pulled Sarah into a hug to try and stop her shaking. Her skin was freezing, and I saw her fox ears pop out through her hair, twitching with fear. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes and asked if I was not afraid. She told me the demon was centuries older and much more powerful than she was, and she was terrified of what would happen if he got inside. I cut her off and told her that he would have to go through me first. My own legs were shaking, but I knew I could not show her any weakness. I told her to stay exactly where she was while I went to double-check all the locks. I made sure every window was deadbolt and added an extra lock to the front door. By the time I got back to the living room, the scratching had stopped and the figure across the street had vanished. Sarah was still huddled on the sofa, but she seemed a little calmer. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, though I could not quite tell if it was trust or something deeper. She asked me if I was telling the truth about not being afraid. I sat down next to her and admitted that I was actually terrified, but that I was even more afraid of what would happen to her if I threw her out. She looked surprised for a moment before letting out a little laugh despite her teary eyes. She teased me for trying to be a hero when I was clearly scared. I felt my face get hot and insisted I was just being realistic about the situation. Things between us started to shift after that night. She stopped just following me around and asking questions and actually started helping out around the apartment. She started cleaning the place while I was at work and even tried her hand at cooking. Her first attempt at a stir-fry was so salty I had to drink a gallon of water, but I did not have the heart to tell her the truth when she looked at me with such hope. I just told her she was off to a great start. She also started learning how to use the internet and keep up with the news. Sometimes she would point at a celebrity on TV and brag about being prettier than them, which always made me laugh. But the biggest change was that she stopped trying to flirt with me all the time. The constant teasing and suggestive looks were gone, replaced by a much more comfortable and quiet connection. She started leaning against my shoulder whenever we watched a movie together. If I was working late, she would bring me a glass of warm milk and just give my shoulder a gentle pat before heading to bed. That simple and quiet support meant more to me than any of her earlier flirting. We did not see the demon again, but the threat still felt very real, like a disaster waiting to happen. Sarah was becoming more withdrawn, and I would often find her staring out the window in the middle of the night. She was always looking toward Sunset Ridge. I knew she wanted to go back and reclaim her home, but she never brought it up because she did not want to worry me. Then one day I came home to an empty living room. There was a cold cup of tea on the table, next to a note written on a piece of paper from my notebook. The handwriting was a bit messy, but it was clear she had put a lot of effort into writing it. She wrote that her leg was better and her strength had returned, so she could not stay in hiding any longer. She said she had to go back to the ridge to deal with the rat demon and take back her home. She told me that if anything happened to her, I should keep the mug she had bought me with her own money. She finished the note by thanking me for saving her on that blizzard night. I stared at the note for a long time and felt a heavy ache in my chest. I wondered why she even mentioned the mug, and if she was worried I would just forget about her. I called her a stupid fox under my breath. I grabbed my coat and ran out to catch a cab to the ridge. I kept telling myself that I was not being impulsive or acting out some cheesy movie scene. I just realized I did not want to go back to an empty apartment and stare at a mug that would never be used again. Sunset Ridge was even more rugged and isolated than I had expected. I started hiking up the trail and watched as my phone signal slowly died out. As the sun went down, I heard the sound of a struggle and a piercing animal scream from somewhere up ahead. I started running toward the noise and came upon a clearing filled with jagged rocks. My heart stopped when I saw Sarah in her half-fox form. Her beautiful silver tail was matted with blood and covered in dirt. She was fighting a grotesque, gray-furred creature that had to be the rat demon. Its claws looked like iron hooks, and it was tearing into her arms as she struggled to defend herself. It was clear that she was losing the fight. I saw her pull out a glowing bead, which I assumed was the source of her power. She was clearly trying to use it against the demon, but she was so weak that the light was barely flickering in her hand. I screamed for him to let her go as I grabbed a heavy branch and swung it at the back of the demon's head with everything I had. The branch snapped on impact. The creature let out a roar of pain and spun around to face me. Its glowing red eyes were filled with pure fury. He demanded to know where I had come from in a raspy, horrible voice before swatting me aside like a fly. I went flying and hit a rock so hard that my vision started to go dark. But my distraction gave Sarah the opening she needed. She lunged forward and shoved the glowing bead directly into the demon's chest. There was a blinding flash of white light, followed by a horrific scream as the creature disintegrated into a cloud of black smoke. Everything went silent except for the sound of the wind. Sarah stumbled over to me and took my face in her hands, her tears falling fast and heavy on my cheeks. She sobbed and asked if I was out of my mind for coming there and risking my life. I was in agony, but I managed to give her a weak smile anyway. I reminded her about the note she left me and joked that I had to come and make sure she was okay, because that mug she bought me was expensive. I told her I didn't want the money she spent on it to go to waste. She was caught off guard and started laughing through her tears, giving me a playful punch on the chest before immediately apologizing. She called me the biggest idiot in the entire world. I reached out and gently flicked the tip of one of her furry ears. I told her to stop yelling and just help me get home before that tea she made me got any colder. She helped me walk all the way back down the trail. It was pitch black out, but she kept her tail wrapped around my wrist the entire time. It was warm and soft, like a bond that could never be broken. Once we were back in Chicago, Sarah found a job working at a shipping warehouse nearby. She took the work very seriously and spent her entire first paycheck on a new coat for me. She told me it was her way of upgrading the debt she owed me for saving her life. She managed to get her home back and now heads out to the ridge on the weekends to fix it up. She even bought a mattress for her stone bed and joked about how she was upgrading her living standards as a spirit. I asked her what she was planning for the future, and she told me she was going to stay with me. She pointed out that our agreement never said anything about us living together forever. I did not even know how to respond to that. She gave me a beautiful smile and nudged against my chest just like she had on the night we met. The snow had all melted away, and the apartment was filled with bright morning sunlight. I looked down at her silver hair and realized that I was stuck with her for good. I also realized that I did not mind it one bit. We often think that love has to make sense or be easy to explain. But at the end of the day, all that matters is finding someone who is willing to share their life and their happiness with you, no matter how messy it gets.